Great. Hello and welcome everyone to another Center for Education Neuroscience seminar. My name is Yasin Arslan and I'm a PhD candidate at UCL Institute of Education. In today's seminar, we welcome Dr. Firat Soylu from the University of Alabama. Dr. Soylu is an associate professor of educational psychology and neuroscience at the University of Alabama. His research centers on the structural and functional correlates of learning and cognition in the brain, embodied cognition, and the implications of neuroscience studies for learning and teaching. Firat has played a leading role in establishing a PhD concentration and an undergrad major in education neuroscience at the university. Currently, he serves as the program coordinator for the Educational Neuroscience program, and I had the great privilege of joining his weekly lab discussions in 2021, a while ago. In today's session, Firat will give us a talk on the bodily foundations of mathematical cognition. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat and we will get back to them after the talk. Now, over to you, Firat.
Yeah, Yasin, thank you very much for the kind introduction and for the invitation. I'm very excited. So let's just get started. So I'm going to talk about what does it mean for mathematical cognition to be embodied, because that's one of my interests. And then I'm going to also talk about how should we change the way we study mathematical cognition, given what we know about embodiment. So these are the general framing questions. So numerical cognition as a field, I mean, this is a numerical cognition, mathematical cognition group, so there's no need to really define it, but it's a field that studies the sociocultural, developmental, cognitive, and biological aspects of mathematical abilities. And when we think about history of numerical cognition, it goes back to really about 19th century when people hadn't started doing fMRI scans or even EEG yet, but they had patient studies, neuropsychological cases when when people had injuries or lesions in the brain and lost some of their mathematical abilities, then people were able to tell which parts of the brain related to which mathematical functions. And then there were some also early studies about mathematical insights, learning and teaching methods, mathematical introspection, not experimental studies, but still investigations on mathematical thinking. And then there came the cognitive revolution in the 1950s. And this was an exciting time. It was at the same time emergence of artificial intelligence together with cognitive science, two sides of the same coin. And with the cognitive revolution, we had a few very influential ideas emerging, and one of them was the computational theory of mind. And the basic idea here was that when you look at computation and information processing, you can separate the hardware components from the algorithmic and computational processes, and that you can actually realize cognitive states across different hardware systems. So there was the idea of multiple realizability. And of course, we had the emergence of symbolic AI and connectionism and many different influential ideas. But these ideas also had an impact on the way we studied cognition. So cognitive science is a field focused on mathematical modeling of cognitive processes and behaviors. And with that came the idea that you can actually just study the algorithmic and computational processes without worrying too much about the biological correlates. And that includes, to some extent, the nervous system, but more so the body. They didn't really worry about that too much. So it was the study of the mind as an abstract notion. But after that, we had some alternative approaches emerging, like embodied and situated cognition and ecological psychology. You're probably familiar with these ideas, even though these are not single theories. These are collections of theories, these large-scale research programs with multiple different theories. but with the common notion that cognition is grounded in the body and the body's interactions with the environment. So this was a different perspective than what cognitive science or cognitivism presented. And then cognitive neuroscience emerged as a major field in the 90s with the invention of fMRI. And, people have done a lot of fMRI studies in the 90s. And, since cognitivism was still strong, what we essentially did was to take these cognitive models that we already had and then use these new neuroimaging methods to look for these concepts that we had in cognitive science in the brain. So in a sense, we first invented the concepts, these cognitive mental terms, and then looked for them in the brain. And we spent the 90s doing that. And then, of course, part of that effort was the idea that we have functional modules in the brain, and brain regions have specific functions attributed to them. But starting with about 2000, in the 2000s, we started realizing that we don't have regions matching with functions, but it's rather each function participating many different functions, and each function making use of many different regions. So we had the emergence of dynamic and complex systems, implementations of dynamic and complex systems in neuroimaging and cognitive neuroscience, and network science. Of course, these fields are analytical fields that are used across different fields of science, but they had a big impact on the way we do neuroimaging. So this is kind of the general overview, historical overview. So what we do in numerical cognition is we try to understand specific processes that are important for the way we process numbers. And one of them is magnitude representation and processing. So we focus on simple capacities like being able to distinguish between two objects of different sizes. So if you look at these squares, and if I ask you what is different about them, you'll be able to quickly tell that the one on the right is bigger. And then if I ask about these objects, the ones on the left and the ones on the right, you can look at them and then say, oh, okay, the one on the left has 4 dots, and the collection on the right has 3 dots. You do that before even you count. So it just occurs to you, you see these numbers immediately. But if I ask you about these collections, then, it might take a while for you to count. But if I ask you to respond very quickly, well, you can say, okay, the one on the left has more dots than the one on the right. So you can come up with an approximation fairly quickly. So even though these are simple competencies, the way we can do them in terms of their biological correlates, they're complex. And we are still trying to understand how we can do things like this. And across different species, different vertebrates, animals can do these tasks like we do, right? They can distinguish the collections on the left or the right, whether we are talking about just physical magnitudes or quantities. But we also have the added ability to associate these numerical magnitudes with symbols. So we can do symbolic mathematics. And if you look at the history of it, it goes back several thousand years. I think maybe 6,000-7,000 years. In Mesopotamia, there's some evidence that we start using symbolic numbers. And these emerged across different cultures depending on our needs for numbers. So one curious thing about this is that we really didn't go through any process of evolution to be able to use symbolic numbers. But just as a result of cultural evolution, we were able to start using symbols to express and represent numbers. So what that means is really when we do symbolic mathematics, we are using systems that evolved for other functions, not for symbolic math. Because a few thousand years is not enough time to biologically evolve. So we were ready for this new cultural invention, and we started using it. But biologically, we haven't changed much since we started using these numbers. And before that, there was no evolutionary pressure to use symbols to represent numbers. So we use existing systems to be able to do this new cultural competency. So when we study numerical cognition, especially when we do neuroimaging, our goal is to understand how brain systems support numerical skills. And the traditional thing that we have been doing is do neuroimaging studies with a few tasks, and then create contrasts, and then try to understand how the functions match with brain regions. And then we do meta-analysis studies, and then meta-analysis studies show which findings are more reliable, and then we come up with models that aggregate over these findings, and then provide us with explanations about the neural system supporting these different mathematical functions. And so I'm just showing a few examples. There are many different models like this one. And in this case, we have some very consistent findings in the numerical cognition literature. And one of them is the representation of numerical magnitude matching with intraparietal sulcus, for example, or angular gyrus participating in or supporting verbal coding of numbers and things like retrieval of arithmetic facts. So we put these functions on these models and then match them with regions. And this is another model that does the same thing. This is more of a slightly more networked version. But, and we had these mental terms like we have number forms and numerical quantity, working memory, cognitive control. Some of these are domain specific. They're specific to numerical cognition, like numerical magnitude representation. And then others are domain general, like cognitive control. But we map these different functions that are defined with brain regions. But when you think about these functions, these are actually functions that we identified independent of the biological correlates. So we came up with these concepts, like cognitive control, for example, has been around for a while. And then now we are looking for it in the brain, right? So we think that we should have these functions, things like executive control or cognitive control, or episodic memory, and then we look for them in the brain. So this is kind of interesting that we don't look at the biological system first to define the functions, but we define the functions and then look for them in the brain. So when you think about numerical magnitude, the way we model it, numerical magnitude processing. So for example, we can have a numerical magnitude comparison task with symbolic numbers. And then we can ask the subject to do this task. And the way we think this happens is that the subject takes the stimulus in, and then the numbers are represented in the brain, whatever that means, representation. There are some philosophical discussions about what that means, and then produces a response. And we think that these events happen to some extent independently. There's the input, and then the processing and representation, and then we produce an output. So this is the cognitivist framing. And when you look at the history of where these ideas are coming from, again, it goes back to the 50s of cognitive revolution. So there's this paper written by McCulloch, and it has this funny title, so I wanted to put it here. What's a number that a man may know it, and a man that he may know a number? One of the funniest titles probably of any paper. So here McCulloch proposes the idea that, because he's a neurophysiologist, he studied the neuron, and the neuron looks like a computational unit. It receives inputs and then does some calculation and then produces an output. So since it acts like a computational unit, then it's quite possible that, an interconnected collection of these neurons can carry out these logical operations, which actually started the connectionist paradigm in artificial intelligence. So then, with this type of thinking, we can actually think of the brain as a form of computer, a connectionist model, and it can carry out these operations that can realize these numerical operations. So when you do that, you actually kind of take out the body altogether from the system, and then you start treating the brain as a generic neural network. And then there were other, of course, paradigms as part of this cognitivist framing. There was the symbolic approach. And there's this quote from Newell and Simon: "A physical symbol system has the necessary and sufficient means for general intelligent action." And the idea here is, again, when you have a symbolic system, a system that can manipulate symbols, right? So this is a different approach to AI, really, than the connections paradigm. But it still gets to the idea that if you have just a general Turing machine, any kind of computer, and it has, of course, the capacity to process symbols, then it can create intelligent action. So with this idea also came along the idea that the human brain is also a generic computer, that we can actually treat it like that. And of course, along with that, we had the computational theory of mind, where we have these modules in the brain that's carrying out specific type of computations. And all of these ideas really take out the significance of the body, the bodily morphology, its evolutionary past, and its interactions with the environment. And the model that I showed before really carries inherits these ideas from the 50s and 60s. So my motivation with this new research program is that I've been doing research on the relation between fingers and math for a while, different aspects of the finger-math relation, and I'm interested in embodied cognition. And I've been finding myself in a position where, I'm interested in this body and math relation, but I have difficulty explaining findings, putting them in a model. And it's not because of lack of the empirical findings, it's because of lack of the theoretical approaches that would help me kind of explain these findings, for example, in the context of fingers and math. And then also designing studies. And I mean, part of the difficulty is we have these terms that are really so ingrained in our minds. And these terms emerged again with the cognitive revolution. And when we talk about processes in the brain, we are essentially defining computational processes that we didn't find in the brain. We invented a priori, without looking in the brain. And then now we are trying to put them somewhere in the brain. And then I've been having difficulties both in terms of these the lack of the theoretical approaches, but also new methodologies that will be more suited for investigations on embodiment of math. So I think there are three guiding principles that can actually help us kind of address some of these issues that we are having, at least I'm having. One of them is to think about the evolutionary background. And then the other one is also when we think about these capabilities, skills, number of skills that we have, thinking of them in relation to other skills that we have, not necessarily cognitive to, sensorimotor, bodily skills, perhaps. And then thinking about how we can apply these perspectives in research. So one concept that I find helpful in thinking about these issues is cognitive ontology. So cognitive ontology, it sounds like a big word, but it's actually kind of fairly simple, but it captures a very substantial idea. A cognitive ontology is a set of cognitive processes and the interrelationships defined between them. And we have a dominant cognitive ontology right now. And we have terms like, as I mentioned before, long-term memory, problem solving, cognitive control, auditory processing. So all these are different modules, actually, we are defining capabilities. And then the neuroimaging work that we have done so far, to some extent, localizes these processes in the brain. And that also contributes to our definitions of the relations across these concepts. So can we define a new cognitive ontology that doesn't borrow these computational terms that were not found in the study of the biological systems? Maybe processes that emerge from the study of the biological systems and not only confined to the nervous system, but also to the body in general, bodily systems in general, and the body's interactions with the environment in authentic contexts. So can we define such a new ontology? How would those primitives, these processes, foundational processes, would look like? What type of processes would they be, and how would we define them? So those are the questions, I think, relevant questions that I ask. So again, we need to, when doing so, as people studying mathematical cognition, we need to think about the biological and cultural evolution, but also think about all the findings about how sensorimotor systems contribute to number processing. And in terms of studying the brain systems, we need to think about these new approaches about networks, distributed, dynamic, and complex networks in the brain. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit. So one idea that connects these ideas about thinking about evolutionary context and also this new type of neuroimaging studies is the idea of neural reuse. The idea with this one is, again, as I mentioned before, we haven't gone through enough of an evolutionary process to develop these math skills. So they use existing systems. So then there's some reuse. So which systems were reused to support mathematical skills? So that's a question that we can ask. And as part of my work with the fingers and math, one of the claims is that sensorimotor systems that support manual action with hands and fingers were reused for mathematical abilities. So then, if that is the case, and if you are trying to understand biological correlates of math, then we need to really study these sensorimotor circuitry that enable us to do all kinds of manual actions. So we further need to look into that literature. And then we kind of expand the literature base. We are not only looking at specific math skills, but we are trying to understand the sensorimotor systems. And of course, in doing so, since we are talking about sensorimotor systems, we need to think about how the brain, body, and the environment assemblies emerge dynamically in authentic tasks, and kind of look for these networks. And one thing with these networks is, if you look at neuroimaging literature, and my papers is part of this literature, we tend to focus on cortical systems. But I mean, what we have been seeing over the years is that even though our models mostly focus on cortical systems, we actually consistently see activations in subcortical structures, in the cerebellum. But we don't have explanations for those, because why? We don't know what those systems, those subcortical structures do. And then we also separate things like emotion and cognition. We think that cognition is more cortical and emotion is more subcortical, even though neuroimaging evidence shows that they are actually quite intertwined. And it is actually a challenge to separate, to do such like artificial separations, because in authentic tasks, you cannot really separate emotion from cognition, and they're not separated at the neural level in terms of just the cortex and the subcortical structures. So they are actually quite complex and distributed networks we are dealing with. So just going back to magnitude processing, again, it is the ability in general to estimate the and represent the magnitudes across different modalities. So it's not only visual, but also auditory, olfactory, etc. And research on magnitude processing shows that we have this magnitude representation and processing system that's not only used for numerical magnitudes, but physical magnitudes in general. And there's a claim that the magnitude processing system is a precursor for the numerical magnitude system. And there's some overlap there. That we have a common magnitude processing system used for different forms of magnitudes. So just to give an example for how we can shift our perspective about how we think about mathematical abilities, let's just think about magnitude processing from the perspective of ecological psychology. So not just a module that represents numerical magnitudes, but as a system that helps us interact with the environment. So the foundational principle with ecological psychology is that we perceive our environment based on our ability to act on it. So when you look around, you don't just perceive, you don't just receive inputs, but you are actually constantly simulating action possibilities. And that's what perception is, thinking about how you can act on the environment. So you cannot actually separate action and perception, or action from perception. Perceiving is a form of action because you are simulating action possibilities, even though you are just passively sitting without moving any limbs, any part of your body. It is still a form of action because your motor systems are also activated. So in the context of magnitude processing, we have all this accumulated evidence that's showing that magnitude processing is a sensorimotor skill, and it is uh, interrelated with our bodily morphology and our repertoire of previous interactions with the environment. And it's actually a form of acting or thinking about the action possibilities. So some of this evidence, the older evidence is things like the overlap of the numerical magnitudes and physical magnitudes processing in the context of certain tasks. So for example, in tasks where you ask people to grasp blocks with digits written on them, even when these blocks are of the same size, if you have larger digits written on some of the blocks, the subject will open their fingers more because there's a larger number written on it, which shows that there's an overlap between the two magnitude systems. One that's serving while you are grasping an object, the other one is for representing numerical magnitudes, and they overlap. Or when you prime the estimation about the size of an object with numbers, people change their estimations. And then there's also the very familiar effects like the snark effect that shows the relation between representation of numerical magnitudes and proprioception, the distance effect, size congruity effect, all just examples for how these physical magnitude and action systems overlap with numerical magnitudes. So based on these, there were some early theories about how we have a shared magnitude system. It's called the atom theory, a theory of magnitudes, and how this system is grounded in the sensorimotor system. And then there's also more recent studies, really interesting studies showing that, when you estimate the size of an object, that's actually you actually estimate objects to be closer if they are easier to grasp, or you estimate the size of an object relative to your hand size. So if you have smaller hands, you actually estimate the objects to be bigger. Because remember, it's not just abstractly representing magnitudes. This is about acting on the environment. So it's not just pure perception. When you look at an object, you're actually estimating if you can grasp that object. That's why you have the ability to estimate its magnitude. And it makes sense that some of these estimations are biased by your bodily morphology, because that's how you act on the environment with your body. So you take that into consideration as well. And also object sizes are perceived relative to body size. So these are just some of the effects that were found. And there are so many other findings like this that show that our bodily morphology, our abilities, and previous experiences change the way we judge magnitudes in general across different modalities, not only visual. So then let's just go back to this idea that intraparietal sulcus is a magnitude processing module. So the behavioral evidence shows that we don't have just perceiving and representing magnitudes in isolation. So it's part of an action system. But also neuroimaging evidence in the specifically regarding intraparietal sulcus also shows that intraparietal sulcus participates in many different functions. It's an association area. It's a higher level visual processing area. It integrates multimodal information for proprioception and generally acting on the environment with interacting with objects. Different parts of intraparietal sulcus has different connectivity profiles structurally, and it also participates in different functions. It's particularly important in manual action and manual manipulation of objects in the space around the agents. And it's also these studies looking at the functional diversity, and functional diversity referring to how many different functions a region participates, shows that IPS is one of the most functionally diverse areas in the brain. So it participates in many different functions. So it is definitely not just a magnitude processing module or representation module. It's actually a module. If it's a module, it's a region that participates in many different networks. It doesn't just realize a function by itself, but it participates in these networks that are important for acting on the environment, integrating multimodal information. So it's a core sensorimotor association area. So it's a bit, perhaps, as numerical cognition researchers, we want to keep things simple, but we are really maybe oversimplifying things when we just say IPS is a magnitude representation system. So it seems like there's actually a more complex story in the background, that the way we do magnitude representation and processing is part of a larger story or wider story of sensorimotor processing. It's similar. So it's similar for another system that we have in our numerical cognition models. So angular gyrus is often referred to as the verbal coding area in numerical cognition models. And it's not for it's for good reason, because we have all this evidence showing that angular gyrus activates more in retrieval tasks versus calculation tasks, for example. So that's replicated many times. And it has consistently been found active in language tasks. So it's considered to be part of this network called the Perisylvian language network. So it makes sense that we think that angular gyrus has something to do with retrieval of arithmetic facts for verbal coding of numbers. So it makes sense. It matches with the evidence. However, is angular gyrus really a verbal area? So, I mean, here the question is, yes, it becomes active when you have these tasks that require verbal processing. It's also when you have contrasts between tasks that require memory retrieval versus calculation. It's consistently being found active. But are these enough reasons to attribute verbal coding of numbers to this region? So when you look at angular gyrus, similar to intraparietal sulcus, it participates in many different tasks. It's actually perhaps, I think, more functionally diverse than even IPS. It's one of the most functional diverse areas in the brain. It's different segments of angular gyrus participates in different networks. And in general, it's thought to participate in heteromodal integration for semantic processing. So what does it mean? It's another fancy term, heteromodal integration. The idea here is that, so there's this larger theory of embodied cognition and semantic processing, is that semantic processing is a form of sensorimotor simulation. So when you think of a past memory, for example, or when you are reading a book that describes different bodily states, a situation that a character is going through, you're actually mentally simulating these sensorimotor states to make sense of the content. So an angular gyrus, and when I say simulating sensorimotor states, I'm talking about all these different modalities coming together. And angular gyrus participates in the integration of these different modalities. And I have some difficulty talking about this because we really don't have quite the language to describe what we are talking about when we say sensorimotor processing. Because our cognitive ontology really still doesn't allow us to talk about these theories, these new theories of cognition quite well, because we don't have the language for it yet. That's part of the problem. So another thing that I read this paper recently, this Alico paper, it's arguing that this Perisylvian language network, or the cortical language network that we claim to exist, might be actually just an output of a product of the way we analyze data. So when you think about language tasks, so we talk about semantic processing, for example. I mean, depending on the semantic content of the tasks or the trials that you have, you will activate different parts of the network, but then some of these will overlap. And the argument in this paper is that what we call the cortical language network is not really the language network itself. It's just a reduced down version of it that represents the connectivity hubs. Because the networks are so diverse, depending on the form of language processing done and the semantic content, the only thing that you get when you average out across all these different trials with different semantic content, you actually end up getting just the connectivity hubs. And it makes sense, with the previous findings showing that angular gyrus is one of these hubs. And there's a separate body of literature that's talking about how language processing is action-based and how these different sensory motor systems support language processing. So I put a review article here. And you see that with effects like action verbs activating relevant parts of the sensory motor system. So if you say, I kicked him out, and when you're trying to understand that sentence, you literally activate part of the motor system that will participate in the kicking action. Okay, so how are we gonna form this new ontology? Again, one of the principles is looking at, adopting these evolutionary approaches and thinking about how the brain participates in contextual behaviors. All of our tasks are very isolated and decontextualized. So there's this emphasis on contextual behaviors. I'm going to give some examples. But also, so one idea is instead of inventing the concepts and looking for them in the brain, maybe we can look in the brain and see if we can find some foundational sensory motor processes, right, that support different cognitive functions. So isolate these processes and then try to understand what they do, right? Whatever role they play. And it's gonna probably take a while before we can start doing that. But just let's look for these foundational primitive sensory motor processes. So that's another idea. And of course, just in time, we have these large data sets to do this, and also new methods with the computational power we have and then the fancy machine learning methods that we see everywhere now. Maybe we can use these amazing machine learning stuff for this purpose, because what we are looking for are complex patterns that will require many data from many different tasks, both sensory motor, cognitive and otherwise, and also the computational power and analytical approaches to find these hidden patterns, these sensorimotor primitives. So that's something that I'm interested in. So I'm going to give you an example about how a magnitude representation model would look like based on all the stuff that I talked about. So in this paper, the authors proposed, so they went through all the natural behaviors across different vertebrates that involve this type of magnitude processing behavior, and then looked at their neuroarchitecture and looked at all the previous evidence showing different parts of the system that's sensitive to magnitudes, right? And, I'm not going to get into this too much. And admittedly, this is also going a little bit outside of my expertise. But what I found interesting is in this paper, there are these studies that we don't really consider much in numerical cognition because, they are with animal models and kind of different, but actually informing something that we are interested in, which is magnitude processing. So it turns out there are actually systems that are sensitive to numerical magnitudes that are in the midbrain. So this region called superior colliculus, it is the optic tectum in non-mammals. So this exists across different vertebrates. So, I mean, as you can imagine, it goes hundreds of millions of years in history, and it responds to size manipulations. So it's not, I mean, it's surprising because it's a very primitive system, and it exists in across different vertebrates. So this is just an example, of course. I mean, this also doesn't mean that superior colliculus is a magnitude processing module. It's not. It is just across the different levels as you go from the midbrain to the subpallial structures, and then pallium, the cortex in the mammals. You have all these different systems that might be participating in this core ability that we are interested in. And it's not just the cortex, it's not just IPS, it goes as deep as the midbrain. And there's evidence for it from other areas in biology. And in this model, the fascinating thing was that they built this magnitude representation and processing model that includes these midbrain structures, thalamus, all these loops, circuitry for, sensory motor processing. and kind of consider these in the natural context with authentic tasks. So there's this quote that I loved from a recent paper of Pessoa, and so they are talking about how these mental terms, like things like working memory and cognitive control, etc., are things that we invented and we are looking for them in the brain, blah blah. But the quote is, vertebrate neuroarchitecture does not respect the boundaries of standard mental terms, which actually kind of captures the essence of it, that you take this concept and try to fit it into the brain, and it just is defiant. It doesn't accept it because that neuroarchitecture is much more complex than that. So then what are we going to do? Well, we can focus on just the large-scale brain circuitry for sensorimotor processing and consider their function in real-world scenarios. And then try to kind of delineate these sensorimotor functions. So I want to leave about at least 10 minutes for questions. So I'm going to be done probably in about 3 minutes. Okay, so this is the part that I babble because I'm trying to design a study now, and I have a paper where I put all of these ideas, and it's under review now. But it is the territory that I don't quite feel comfortable because I'm kind of trying to figure out what to do next. But I'm thinking maybe I can do an fMRI study and take a step in, towards isolating these sensorimotor building block processes. Like, these are building block processes. We don't exactly know what they do, because as soon as we start thinking about what they might be doing, we think about computers and the way computers work, which is going to be different than how we do it. So then we'll need to think more about the evolutionary context and the body's interaction with the environment. Whatever that is, come up with some methods of designing a neuroimaging experiment to start isolating these sensorimotor building block processes. So that's what I am trying to, and I'm going to show you some ideas that I have. So I started using these machine learning methods and kind of comparing them with traditional methods, with both in the context of EEG and fMRI, and it's not just not just a new fashion machine learning. I think there's some value in that, like in capturing patterns that you wouldn't be able to isolate otherwise in large scale data. So just a few examples. This is a relatively early paper, so about 10 years ago. So, one idea is that instead of having one-to-one matches in the brain, we have many-to-many matches in the brain, meaning that each region participates in many functions, and each function uses more than one region. They use multiple networks composed of multiple regions. So one concept that's helpful is functional diversity. I mentioned this before. And the way you study functional diversity is you get a bunch of tasks. And these tasks are not just from one domain. So you have sensorimotor tasks, perceptual tasks, motor tasks, you have cognitive tasks, emotional tasks. And these categories are not really meaningful maybe, but that's how we understand them for now. You take all these tasks and then you check to see the participation of one region across all these tasks, and then create a map like this. So this is one way to deal with the complexity. And then there are, again, with machine learning, it's an ocean. So I'm just gonna give you an example for the type of thing that can be helpful in the problems that I try to identify in this talk so far, and that is this type of in this study, Poldrack and his colleagues, they analyze data, fMRI data, across different domains, and these are things like gambling decisions and rhyme judgments, working memory, so kind of different type of tasks. And the goal was to train machine learning algorithms that can decode the trials. So you collect the data, and they kind of brought together data that they already collected from different studies. But the idea is that you train this algorithm that can take the fMRI data as input, and then that can determine what the subject was doing during that trial. after being trained, right? So this is decoding. It's like reading minds. But the significance of decoding is, and we have done a decoding study too with EEG to check to see how different it is from parametric testing. The significance of it is that when you do this, you can actually check to see which voxels provide the type of information that helps the algorithm distinguish across all these different tasks, right? So then those voxels, wherever they are probably the ones that are important in distinguishing across these different tasks. So they did this with different machine learning approaches. They used neural networks and support vector machines and etc. But the interesting thing is they came up with a way of isolating these networks that are thought to underlie these foundational processes. So these networks emerge across these different tasks, right? I think there are, I can't remember how many tasks, but maybe 10 tasks, let's say. So you see these networks across these different 10 tasks, but at different weights, right? So they came up with, the way they came up with these dimensions is they take, we have all this complex fMRI data, 200,000 voxels, and then they find a way of, they use this dimension reduction methods to simplify it, and then run it through a neural network. And then they look at the layers, hidden layers in the neural network, and then extract this representation. But at the end, this is what the pipeline produces. But the important thing here is that these are taught to represent networks or primitives that participate in each of these tasks at different weights. We don't know what they do, right? So there are these 6 dimensions, each dimension matching with a pattern in the brain, but they participate in each of these tasks at different weights. And these dimensions are important for distinguishing across these different task categories. So something like this might be a step towards identifying these foundational primitives, right? Because you know that these primitives, they participate in each of these tasks, different weights. So you can actually go into the interpretation mode and you can say, oh, okay, this primitive seems really important for rhyme judgments and also for gambling decisions. So what's in common? You can interpret the task context, you can look at the previous literature, but you can actually isolate a new process using a method like this. So I'm currently working on a study like this, but this is more related to fingers and math. This is an fMRI study that has different tasks. Some of them are sensorimotor tasks that are, that were previously studied and that are relevant to finger math, like finger tapping, finger noses, graspability, and then tasks like magnitude comparison, non-symbolic and physical, and a working memory task, cognitive control task, and then some arithmetic tasks together with symbolic number comparison. And the idea is to collect fMRI data across all these tasks and then do the machine learning thing where we develop a decoding algorithm and then try to do something similar to what I've shown you before, kind of try to extract these foundational primitives that help distinguish across these tasks and isolate these networks that participate in these tasks with different weights. And of course, from previous research, we know that sensorimotor tasks tend to be more localized, more focused in the cortex. So, if you see a primitive having a really large weight for something like finger tapping, you can deduce that it might be related to motor control. And the more interesting thing is if you see that also playing a role, let's say for arithmetic or cognitive control or some other task. So this would require some kind of interpretation with the same idea that maybe we can isolate some of these sensorimotor processes, especially related to fingers and maths and magnitude processing, and see how they are related to these more cognitive tasks. Okay, I think we have 10 minutes for questions here. Thank you.
Superb. Thank you very much, Firat, for this great talk. I would like to start the question and answer session with a question of mine, although I have a few. So, from your perspective, I'll start from a very general one, if you don't mind me. So, what are the primary implications of understanding mathematical cognition alongside sensorimotor capacities for educational practices?
Um, for educational practices, I mean, so we already have some answers for that, right? All this research, and this is, I'm talking about this because this is most related to what I've done so far. The research on fingers and math helped us understand how, fine motor skills and things like finger noses and finger tapping, finger counting habits, and, its cultural interactions. Um, these types of findings can help design learning interventions. So people design learning interventions that involve sensory motor interactions with fingers, things like apps or non-technological, activities with fingers. I think part of the stigma about using fingers in classes, in math, children used to be discouraged from doing that. And I think maybe some of the stigma kind of started disappearing thanks to that body of research. In terms of how this type of direction would have an impact in general, I frankly think that cognitivism in general, like thinking of human cognition as a computational process, has implications in how we design architecture, cities, schools. I think it has really large scale implications. I mean, not specific to my research. My research doesn't per se like has those implications, but this type of research in general, because then as soon as you do that, you actually show the relation between environment, interactions with the environment, and how it has this deep impact on the way we think, how they are intertwined. And I think, the way our workspaces are designed, our learning environments are designed, seem to ignore the body and the body's needs. This is kind of a larger topic that would require a more extensive discussion, but I think these efforts in embodied cognition uh, has almost like a critical theory kind of implication where we have been long have been oppressed in a sense with the assumption that we we are some form of computer, I guess, right? But we are biological creatures with an evolutionary history, with sociocultural history. So I think it gives us mechanisms to explain that this type of embodied cognition and brain research.
Right, great. Thank you, Firat. And we, I think, have a question from Tehreem.
Hello.
Hi.
Hello.
Hello. Yep.
Thank you for having me. And I really like the whole lecture from Dr. Firat, if I'm pronouncing his name correctly.
Thank
Okay.
you.
I wanna ask about the AG. If there is a trauma or trauma due to accident of that particular area, if the brain experienced something, does it affect the ability for the computational or the mathematics? Does it in any way affects that area? Well, our ability because of that area, because of the trauma in that area.
Yeah, I mean, there are all these case studies with lesions and injuries, and some of those also talk about loss of mathematical skills. And in fact, that's what we knew about mathematical cognition in the brain before neuroimaging was mostly thanks to those patient studies. And I think, part of the reason why we thought that these functions were localized is because let's say you have an injury in angular gyrus, which there are actually cases like that, and then the subject or the patient loses the ability to do basic calculations. Um, I mean, it's easy to deduce that that region is the calculation region. It happens, right? So you have a lesion in a specific area and you lose a very specific skill. So it can definitely happen. Of course, that doesn't mean that that region alone is responsible for that skill, but it means that that region is crucial for that skill.
Thank you. Actually, related to that, Firat, I wonder what Tahrim said. Well, would you also agree that when a brain region is damaged, other parts of the brain can take up its functions? Can we use this for interparietal sulcus as well? For example, if there is a trauma, if there is a damage in that brain region, can other parts of the brain take up its function to do the task?
I don't know. It's hard to speculate, but so with intraparietal sulcus, of course, it has the anterior and posterior segments, and they do different things. There's also the left and right. So there are studies looking at, which side does, participates in numerical magnitude processing and which side non-numerical magnitude processing, and is it the anterior portion and posterior portion? And there are some findings on that. So again, I'm just speculating, which is probably not a good idea. But so let's say you got an injury, and there are individual differences, of course, left, right, or and the weight distribution. But let's say you got an injury and you lost some mathematical abilities. I think it would be natural to expect that maybe you'll regain them thanks to intraparietal sulcus on the other side, unless you also had damaged connectivity between them somehow. So I would just speculate like that. I frankly, I can't remember right now if there are any, I'm sure there are, but if there are any case studies on people with damaged IPS and what happens after that, I cannot remember.
Okay.
I think,
yeah. Yeah, just one last question from me, which is about the future research, actually. Before I go, actually, Rebecca has a question. So, Rebecca, would you like to go?
Thank you, Yasin.
Thank you.
I was just wondering, and it may be something that you haven't thought about, or it may be something you covered and I didn't pick it up, but how does this speak to the possible need for children when learning maths or basic number skills to be able to move around? Because you touched on earlier how children are supposed to behave in classrooms, and of course it's very rigid, they're sitting at desks, etc. So do you think that this could connect in some way to the need for children to move around? And I know that parental feedback is that my child needs to move around in terms of when needing to process some information or when needing to problem solve. Do you think that this is in any way linked?
Yeah, Rebecca, that's a really good question. I would say that. So my wider, more general answer will be that we are a biological system, or we are a species or creature that evolved to move around. We are hunter-gatherers essentially. So I think without knowing anything about the brain, just knowing what we know about our evolution, I think we know that we should be wandering around, right? And it's extremely unnatural for kids to sit down and learn math from a teacher and teaching on a board. It's also unnatural for the teacher as well, because the learning relation we have usually is doing things together. So we already know that everything we have been doing in the last 200 years with education is quite unnatural. But in the context of math, if this idea that there are these sensorimotor primitives or processes, basic processes that support these different cognitive functions, so then how are we going to develop those basic sensorimotor processes? I think I would speculate that, early interactions as early as infants with the environment, and in the context of number development, and that's one of there is literature in the 80s about how the infant's perceptual system develop to distinguish objects in the stream of the perceptual stream, and so that they can develop their first sense of items isolated from their backgrounds, which later becomes perception of quantities, blah, blah, blah. But that's just an example for how the development of the sensory motor systems can actually support development of mathematical skills. I think if I have to speculate, I would say, once we isolate these sensorimotor processes, these foundational processes, I wouldn't be surprised to learn that, for them to develop, you need rich interactions with the environment. And maybe some of these findings that we already have, in terms of the relation between, fine motor skills and you mentioned that you studied these in your lab, the relation between motor control and executive function. Maybe, some of these relations, we will understand why there's a relation once we understand these sensorimotor primitives.
Thank you. That's food for thought, that's for sure.
Okay, superb. Thank you very much for your question, Rebecca, and thanks very much for the great presentation, Firat. This is the end of our talk, and if you have more questions, you can either direct to Firat or you can let me know, and I will be happy to forward it to Firat. So thank you very much, and see you in the next week's seminar. Firat,
Yeah,
would you
thanks
like?
for the invitation and thanks for participating to the audience here. Have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.